This is Steve Orlins, President of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, not coming to you from my ordinary venue, so you don't see my two tigers behind me. But I felt we needed to do this program in short order. The war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, obviously, is front page news every single day. One of the things that has not, and obviously China's role and potential role as a mediator, its continued trade with Russia has been the focus also of a lot of our discussions. One of the things which we haven't discussed sufficiently is China's media, the way it is talking about the war in Ukraine, its effect on the Chinese people, and how that kind of tells us about what's going on in the Chinese government. So we recruited two of America's outstanding experts in this area to talk with us this afternoon. One is Xiaoyu, who is now Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Nevada, Reno. His focus is on Chinese foreign policy and international relations. And the other is Maria Repnikova, who is Assistant Professor of Global Communications at Georgia State University and is an expert on China's media, politics, including propaganda, journalism, and soft power. Both, I should say, most importantly, are fellows in the Public Intellectuals program of the National Committee, where the intent is we take young scholars, young experts, and use them to educate America and America's the public and the elites in America. And that is precisely what they are doing today. But let's start with Maria. Talk about Chinese media coverage of Ukraine. Talk about the concern there is with what the United States government said is misinformation by Chinese media in this area.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me join this very important discussion. So my analysis of Chinese media coverage of Ukraine, the war in Ukraine over the past probably 5 weeks, it's hard to believe it's been this long since the war has started, showcases several themes. I mean, one important theme, I think, is that for Chinese citizens, this war has been largely underreported. For example, the images from the Bucha massacre and other horrendous crimes against humanity committed by the Russian army in Ukraine have not been showcased or widely sort of reported and distributed to Chinese citizens. So underreporting this war, I think it's also a form of silencing, right? It might not be called propaganda, but it's kind of undercovering or not reporting enough about this conflict. But the other themes is that when we see what is reported, one of the key themes is that there's often blame that's being put on the West, in particular on NATO, but also the United States when it comes to instigating this war. So instead of looking at it as Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine, a lot of the analyses and reporting focuses on who is really behind this war in the first place, and it's about militarization of Eastern Europe, of the region, and kind of forcing Russia to react. And in this context, we see that this discussion is somewhat pro-Russia, but it's often masking, really anti-West or anti-NATO statements and sentiments in its coverage. And I think that applies both to external communication that's aimed at global publics, but even more so domestic public in China. So those are kind of the big themes, the big takeaways. And I think the stance in the media hasn't changed that much, even though the war is ongoing. We don't see any fundamental shifts. And I think Bucha massacre is a good example of that. This would be an opportunity to say something else or to report more from Ukraine for the Chinese public to really reveal some of the horrors of this war. We don't see very much on that for domestic public. In particular, I was struck by some of the phrases that were used in very few reports coming out of Chinese media, such as the so-called Bucha incident, right? It's not the incident, but it's so-called, so meaning that there's some ambiguity around that. It requires more investigation, right? We don't have a clear-cut story the way it's presented by Western media or by Ukrainian media as well. So I'll start there. I have more to say, but I wanted to give room for more questions.
But talk about some of the specifics, the specific inaccuracies. One of the things that the U.S. government has been deeply concerned about is, for instance, repeating Russian misinformation about U.S. Bioweapons and chemical weapons facilities in Ukraine. Talk about how the Chinese media has covered that and repeated the disinformation, and what is going on there? What is the court? How does that work? That I know a lot of these journalists, they're generally responsive. I mean, we might not like what they say. You can argue about what caused the war, the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But some of this stuff is just not arguable.
Yeah, so I did observe the repetition of the biolabs, conspiracy theory, we can call it disinformation, fake news, whatever terms we use, but it did appear first in Russian media and Russian official statements. And then we saw almost exact same statements being shared and reported by some Chinese media, but also some foreign ministry spokespeople have also shared some of these statements. So it wasn't just the media, it's also some of these individual actors. And of course, not all, I know it's a very complex system, so I'm not saying that everybody was repeating it, but it was quite striking that this was happening. Nonetheless, I think in some ways, to me, at least this biolabs topic in particular goes back to the kind of contestation of the origins of COVID and kind of back to the pandemics, because we saw a lot of these back and forth accusations between the US and China. And for quite a long time, Chinese governments, at least in some media statements, maybe not the government itself, but some media statements were blaming the US, that the COVID itself has originated in the US, not in China. And I saw some of this also portrayed in some social media platforms, in particular by some diplomats even based in Africa that would kind of, share some of this conspiracy theory that this is actually not China who is to blame for this, but maybe it's even coming from the US. So in some ways, this kind of biolabs theory fits the larger maybe disinformation trends we've been seeing. So it's not a unique example. I think it kind of builds on the larger motivations, but also the larger kind of dynamics here when it comes to this specific topic. But when it comes to other topics in terms of disinformation, we see some selective adaptation of Russian narratives and Russian footage. So for instance, when I was watching, CCTV coverage of the war, we see that a lot of the footage comes directly from Russia or from the Russian side. Like the reporter himself is either based in Moscow, reporting from Russian kind of official press conferences and statements, or reporting directly, incorporating Russian footage. And we see some of that also on social media. With Sputnik, it's a very popular Russian media outlet, often being used as a source by Chinese media. So there's quite a lot of this kind of quotation, selective cooptation, adaptation of Russian media sources, narratives, footage, and of course, much less footage coming from Ukraine. So a lot of this, maybe is opportunistic because the media, I think, are instructed to tell a more pro-Russia story. And as a result, they're kind of not forced to, but it's convenient for them to use Russian footage because nobody else is really telling a pro-Russia story here. Most Western media are using footage from Ukraine. So if you want to tell a more pro-Russia story, you have to kind of rely on Russian footage. So maybe part of it is opportunistic, part of it could be top down, part of it could be the journalists themselves adapting it to appear as if they're, standing in line with the official orders. But we do definitely see this widespread trend of using Russian footage, Russian narratives, Russian media reports in Chinese media.
Professor Pu, is there any difference between kind of the media position and the Chinese government position? Is it kind of viewed is it any different, or is it just hand in glove together?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Steve. I think that potentially there might be a gap between Chinese government's official policy and the media coverage. China, in a general sense, the Chinese government considers three factors. Maybe there are some more, but number one is global balance of power. For that, they want to maintain some kind of strategic partnership with Russia. Number two is UN Charter and sovereignty, including Ukraine's sovereignty. Number three is economic interest. So China's economic interest, economic connections with the West is much bigger, much more important for China. So I think the Chinese leadership think about these three big considerations. My personal observation is the Chinese government's overall policy is try to be neutral. But on the other hand, when they send this kind of guideline to media sort of operations, the media people might selectively highlight some stories, might be more appealing to the public, given the deterioration of U.S.-China relations, especially during the Trump era. You can imagine both at the elite level and the public level have some kind of residual sort of anti-West, anti-US sort of resentment. So media people, and also, by the way, political correctness in that kind of context, sort of highlight this kind of the blaming the US is politically safe than talking about the real origin of the war, or actually criticizing Russia might become politically risky for these media people. So in this kind of overall context, we can imagine at the operational level, media people might tend to sell more anti-West blaming U.S. story rather than the real story about the war itself. I think that might explain. But for actual foreign policy, so actual foreign policy, diplomats, and we can maybe divide the Chinese foreign diplomats into different type, right? So like ambassadors, they really care about how to deliver for the Chinese people. Think about Ambassador Qin or former Ambassador Cui Tiankai. They all want to deliver, stabilize the U.S. China relations, deliver. But the propaganda people, I mean, and even some of the spokesperson, they are performing, right? They try to appeal in domestic audience. So then we can see not only there is a potential gap between media and actual foreign policy of diplomats, even within foreign ministry, different diplomats have different functions. Those ambassadors, they want to deliver, they might work more sort of pragmatically to address issues, but for some of the spokesperson, their function is primarily for domestic mobilization. So they might exaggerate some story, and of course the media might get this kind of story even in a more extreme way. So I think that explains some kind of gap between propaganda narrative and the actual foreign policy.
How high up in the Chinese system does the propaganda narrative get fixed? Does it go all the way up to the president? Does it go up to, An Hongying, the head? Is it the standing committee? Is it the Politburo? Or is it something lower than that? How high up does this need to go?
My general sense is that at the highest level, I mean, Politburo standing committee, always there's one person managing. Part of his work portfolio is to manage propaganda. So I can imagine that at highest level, they provide some sort of broad guiding principle, but they don't manage sort of operational sort of stuff in most cases. Like maybe Ukraine war, they maybe talk about some general principle, right? I mentioned the 3 considerations. They might talk about something like that. But the specific might be Department of Propaganda. They might consult with foreign ministry. They send a specific guidance to state media. I think that they typically don't manage which story will be covered in most daily basis. I don't think so. They manage.
Maria, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I agree with Xiaoyu. I think it's also as a result of this kind of different layers, right, of power, different gatekeepers. We see some improvisation on behalf of some actors. For example, New York Times, I think, reported a few days ago that there were some provisional directives to universities. Some universities were instructing how to talk about the war in Ukraine. But when you click on the link, you actually see it was only one university in Heilongjiang province. It was a very specific example. So it's just one example where, I think it's a bit easy to say, well, yeah, this is happening across the country. It's this mobilized effort, but maybe this particular university was trying to showcase its loyalty or to show that they're abiding by this higher principles of propaganda, but actually it's not a nationwide kind of effort. So for now, we don't see evidence that every university is adopting this kind of instructions, but that's something that often gets attention of Western media.
As I mentioned earlier in my opening comments, there was huge concern in the U.S. government at the repeating of the Russian fake news about the chemical and biological weapon facilities in Ukraine. And there was concern that the senior levels of the Chinese government did not understand how potentially damaging this was, because the history suggests it's a false flag operation by the Russians, and they use that to use chemical or biological weapons. After President Biden made that representation, did the Chinese stop repeating that false narrative?
What I heard is that, of course, Biden-Xi virtual call, there was a very broad agenda talking about no military support, no financial economic support. Maybe the misinformation is part of the conversation. So definitely Chinese government has not yet provided any military support, financial support. I mean, China wants to maintain sort of bilateral economic, but also don't want to suffer from collateral damage. But regarding this misinformation sort of narrative, what I heard is that foreign ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian, part of his function is to sort of like fight back against the Trump era legacy, I think, right? So I think, but you even using this kind of embrace Russia's misinformation. But I heard some maybe policy advisors really caution against using misinformation to fight back previous misinformation. I think there are some voices in the Chinese system urging more caution, and also in terms of media coverage. I at least my observation is there's some nuanced change in the sense that diversify the sources. Previously, Chinese media maybe primarily, maybe even only rely upon Russia sources, but now they also sometimes they simultaneously show both Russian narrative and the Ukraine narrative. And also they've sent their journalists on the ground. I think in the early days, there were no Chinese journalists on the ground. Now they have Chinese journalists on the ground to cover the story. So maybe, hopefully, they would eventually have more nuanced narrative. Yeah.
They had Chinese journalists embedded with Russian troops.
Yeah, that was one news outlet, but also it's worth noting that Chinese media. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, there's one, but I watch is the English channel CGTN.
That's right. Yeah. I was just about to say that CGTN has been doing a very different kind of coverage than CCTV. So we see quite a distinction there, which does suggest that maybe there's an attempt, at least for international audiences, to portray a more complex picture. We do see footage coming from Ukraine, and as Xiaoyu mentioned, journalists being sent to the field and facing quite dangerous conditions like other reporters from Western media. But we don't see, at least I haven't seen as much of that happening for domestic Chinese media. So do the stories kind of travel back or trickle back to domestic Chinese publics? I'm not as certain, but
did they have different levels of censorship for English and Chinese? That they can that the Chinese government can accept more dissent in English than it can in Chinese media?
In general, I think the gatekeepers are different, and the censorship itself varies depending on who's the audience. And I think overall, global channels like CGTN has had a bit more leeway because they're meant to be also kind of a flagship news outlet, right? They're not supposed to be just a propaganda channel. They're meant to compete with other global news outlets like, CNN or Al Jazeera. So that's the positioning that the Chinese state hopes to eventually, for CGTN to eventually occupy. So for that, they need to have more balanced coverage. It's also a matter of competition for discourse power, for soft power, which even though it's been kind of maybe in the shadows for the moment, it's still been a big objective of the Chinese government.
Do we know how many people watch CGTN in China?
I'm not sure about those statistics.
Ingwentai. I've never seen the Ingwentai in China, but maybe that's my own. Xiaoyu, do you happen to know?
I'm not sure. Sometimes some Chinese scholars will post some video from CGTN in WeChat group, but I don't. Maybe not a very popular in China, of course, because it's primarily for domestic, international audience.
There is I certainly, I believe that China is trying to walk an unwalkable line in this conflict. And I believe they need to come over to the moral side, the side which condemns the Russian invasion. And I basically said that on CGTN, and it ran. I mean, it was directly critical, and people seemed to accept it. I've also noticed a fairly high degree of dissent in social media, whether it was the Huawei article early in the invasion, a bunch of professors circulated another article criticizing Chinese government policy. We have a few more professors in the last few days criticizing Chinese policy and saying if we don't take a better policy, none of us will exist. What's going on there? Why this allowance for that kind of dissent?
Maybe I can talk about. I think in terms of foreign policy debate, even China is a one-party system, but for foreign policy, international issues, there are always all kinds of debate. I mean, for some of the issues like Ukraine war, Russian aggression against Ukraine, my observation in China's foreign policy sort of expert community, it's a very polarized topic. So it's a heated debate. Some maybe in virtual conference, some in WeChat group, in others, very much heated debate. So I think like my general sense, there are 4 types of perspective. Let me briefly talk about this. Number 1 is a supporter role perspective, in the sense that China should join the West, sanctioning, even abandoning the Putin's Russia. So that's larger Huawei's perspective, largely belong to this. The second perspective is shirker. So China should avoid as the sort of a damage, try to avoid the damage in this conflict. Number 3 is co-leader. China might not solve the problem sort of single-handedly, but China might join other major powers to try to contribute to the resolve of the problem. Number 4 perspective is spoiler or challenger, in the sense that China should join Russia, largely challenging the U.S. or so-called Western domination. My personal perspective is that all these different ideas in China's expert community are all there. A Chinese government position is somewhere, I think, is between shirker and co-leader. You can see some of the narrative. Sometimes they emphasize China is not the one party. China is not the party of the conflict itself. So that's kind of shirker narrative. Sometimes officials emphasize China is willing to provide humanitarian support and try emphasize political dialogue, multilateral approach. That's called a co-leader narrative. But I think the supporter or spoiler, I think it's more of a, as a sort of perspective. They are still there as part of the potential option, but not yet as China's official policy. I think the official policy still try to be sort of appear to be neutral in the middle ground. So yeah, that's my observation.
What accounts for Huawei's article being able to circulate for so long before it was taken down?
Let me add a little bit background about the Huawei article. Huawei actually is a very influential sort of political scientist, expert in China. He was a former student of Wang Hulin back in his Fudan era. So that maybe partially explain even his article is not the same as China's official policy, but his article could be stay there longer time than some others. And also he initially actually tried to, I heard the story, he initially tried to write that article as a policy memo to the highest level of the top leadership. And then he sent that article, but officials in Shanghai, dare not send his policy memo to the highest level. Maybe, of course, his argument is different from official policy. So he sent to Dr. Liu Yawei, then Carter Center published that. I think partially, and also I heard some of although his article, not every expert agree with his argument, but there are very influential Chinese international relations, foreign policy experts actually agree with Huawei's sort of policy description. So that all contribute to this. I think maybe my sense, this is my speculation, why his article was eventually censored, because he not only talk about foreign policy implication, he also partially talk about domestic political implication. He criticized Putin's Russia. Then he also talking about authoritarian dictatorship has no future. Ultimately, Western democracy is more influential. I think that the domestic sort of implication part of it, AC, might trigger some of the red line in Chinese censorship. I don't think the international perspective is that problematic in the Chinese system. So, because some other experts, at least some, would agree with Huawei in terms of foreign policy implications.
There were many other statements and sentiments on social media that were also, questioning or trying to present a different perspective. Not all of them are well-known scholars. Some of them are just average people. And some of the initiatives I've been looking at is also fact-checking initiatives, like by some journalists who try to fact-check Chinese state media reporting and to suggest that maybe something isn't quite right, or that they check it and see that the other reports from the Western media reported differently. So some of the kind of very subtle efforts that don't get as quickly deleted are still continuing to take place on social media. And the thing that was very striking in the past few days, this is not directly related to Ukraine, but it's related to creative online kind of critiques, is about the COVID lockdown in Shanghai. And we've seen some of these hashtags, in particular one that was a few days ago, it was titled, US is the biggest country of human rights deficit. And of course, this kind of anti-American hashtag was actually occupied by netizens to argue that China is the one with human rights deficit, in particular how the pandemic is being handled, showcases the lack of kind of human dignity, human rights, and so forth. And we've seen all of these efforts taking place over the past week or so, this kind of official hashtags about Zhao Lidian or other anti-US kind of statements being sort of occupied or taken advantage of by the netizens to highlight very different positions. So in some ways, we see this domestic critique at the moment kind of fusing with this Ukraine war in a very interesting way. So they're not directly talking about the war, but they're talking about their own government. So I found that to be really interesting.
Does the debacle in Shanghai as a result of the lockdown and kind of the social media outcry affect this discussion of Ukraine, or they're just two completely separate paths? Maria?
It's a little bit hard to tell yet, but what we do see is that at least some of these anti-Western, anti-American kind of statements or hashtags that are continuing to spread or to be shaping kind of public discourse in social media, they're being, as I said, occupied or taking advantage of by netizens to actually critique Chinese government. So in some ways, we see some of kind of intersection of these two topics, but I'm not sure yet whether or not this lockdown itself is going to influence how the war is allowed to be discussed or covered. We do see some of these hashtags being deleted and kind of replaced with new ones. So there's definitely a pushback from the propaganda system. But in terms of just like the overall kind of space for some critique being present at the moment, or at least early on, I think this is also common for many kind of public opinion crises or major events in China, whether it's international, but especially domestic events. We do see that there is a little bit of space often allocated for some opinions to be expressed, but then very quickly, within days, sometimes it's weeks, the clampdown begins, that it gets sort of cleared out. so I don't think it's unique to this particular crisis. We see some of this kind of maneuvering happening in previous cases. Of course, Ukraine is very unique, but it's also a crisis event, I think, for Chinese public opinion.
This 30 minutes has flown by. Let me just ask one final question. Any chance that the media narrative in China is going to change? I've written and has been reposted in China a lot that China can't walk this line. It's not walkable, and it needs to kind of step up as a global leader and help mediate a resolution of the conflict. And that has not been censored. Obviously, it's a constructive suggestion. So they would, I think that kind of fits within what's allowed to be said, even if they choose not to do it. But is there any chance that this media narrative is going to change and becomes more similar to the Western narrative and really talk about this ongoing tragedy, which may be the greatest tragedy of the 21st century, maybe of the last 80 years? I mean, it's shocking that this friendship with Russia has allowed the Chinese to kind of avert their eyes from what is a humanitarian crisis and ultimately is going to affect China's economy.
Maybe I can also provide this some sort of brief analysis. I think ultimately, there is an expectation gap between the West and the Chinese government, in a sense that I think maybe the Chinese government ultimately would still try to take a middle ground, so to sort of a neutral position as a formal policy. But I still see possibility that there will be more nuanced narrative emerge in China, in a sense that not talking about like China joined the Western narrative, but how about China itself as a sort of more responsible great power, right? The Chinese leaders are always talking about responsible China, try to be a responsible great power. Responsible great power, of course, will take care of its own interests, but also think about the broader international image, international implication. I think that second, these days I see some of the Chinese international relations experts, they increasingly provide a more nuanced narrative. I recently see some articles talking about international politics is not just about geopolitics. It's ultimately about the millions of people's personal lives and personal relationship. I think that kind of sort of like humanized international relations thinking, that kind of voices are emerging in China. I think those kind of voices hopefully will urge the Chinese media to be more nuanced. I think there might be some hope there. Yeah.
Maria?
Yeah, I'm hopeful along with Xiaoyu that there'll be more nuanced perspective, but I'm a little bit, I guess, more skeptical about, also skeptical about the large reversal, just kind of a complete reversal and Chinese media being in tune with Western media in a big way. I think part of it is because, we won't see any changes in the media without a change in official policy. Media in this environment, in the current political environment, is very constrained. So it's very hard to imagine media itself as stepping out of its censorship orders and reporting something dramatically different. I mean, CGTN is one example, but it's oriented towards global audiences. But domestic media, I don't think is going to change its position without official position changing. And the other part of it, I think, is public opinion, nationalistic public opinion. I think, how do you make a big reversal in policy and in media discourse after weeks and weeks and weeks of a very different narrative, in particular anti-US, anti-NATO narrative, positioning China as this challenger, right? At least through the media. I'm not saying that the experts agree on that, but the media has been doing this kind of narrative building. And many netizens on social media supported that. So to reverse that back might also make the Chinese government appear somewhat weak. It's like, well, why didn't we become the bigger kind of mediator in the first place? How did we allow these crimes to go on for this long? So I'm a little concerned about, how would this play out domestically if there was a big reversal? Of course, I'm hopeful for more nuance, and I think that's possible. But a large change, kind of a complete 180-degree change, I think seems a bit unlikely, at least at this time, in my view.
Yeah, as these crimes against humanity are broadcast daily, the deaths of civilians, the tying of hands, and the execution of these civilians. I don't know what percent, I've always wondered what percent of Chinese have access to international news through VPNs, but it's significant. I mean, it's significant. And as that begins to filter up, and I've seen it from folks via WeChat, via other communication mechanisms, where there is increasing concern, even though the official media is one thing, the ability of lots of people, including in the leadership, to access what is an ongoing human tragedy may create the pressure to change. I think what you both correctly point out is the nuance of the coverage. It won't be a reversal, but it will be a gradual change. The Chinese, control of media for political purposes is extremely effective. It's what I wrote my college thesis on in the Chinese Communist Party in the Yan'an period was doing this. So they really are expert. And if there's enough pressure on the leadership from within, and every day is a tragedy, every single day. I've only worn yellow and blue ties for the last 40 days to just remind myself that this tragedy is ongoing and what is happening in Ukraine is unacceptable. And if Zhou Enlai was alive, he would oppose current Chinese policy. And that's important to remember, that sovereignty and territorial integrity is a fundamental tenet, as Xiaoyu doubtlessly teaches all of his students. Chinese foreign policy, it's been one of the 5 unbreakable tenets, and allowing this to happen is simply not what Zhou Enlai would have allowed. So I thank you both so much for doing this on short notice. This has been an incredibly informative discussion. And let's hope for some change and nuance. But thank you both.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.